Good evening, everyone. My name is Anurag Lakra, and on behalf of the Chaplaincy of St. Stephen's College, it is my privilege to welcome all of you to this webinar on visions of the divine, Kabir between Hindus and Christians. Our distinguished speakers for today are Professor Ankur Barua. He's a university senior lecturer at the Faculty of Divinity at the University of Cambridge. We also have with us the Reverend Samuel John Shekhar, chaplain at St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi. And also joining us today is Dr. Alphy Geever, assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi. Before we begin, let me take a moment to introduce the topic for today's webinar to our audience. Kabir was a 15th century Indian poet saint. However, the exact time of his birth and death are uncertain. Most of us have grown up reading Kabir's dohas or couplets. Through these short lines, Kabir imparts unmatched wisdom to his readers. Kabir's conception of God, as seen in his dohas, talks about a nirvana God, that is, one without attributes, and formless, which is all encompassing. Kabir felt that this all encompassing nature of God should make us move away from rigid ideas of religion as well as social inequality based on caste. Kabir's writings are revered and respected in the major religious communities in India. In today's webinar, our distinguished speakers will show us the various aspects of this illustrious poet's thoughts and his life. This is a note to the audience that questions will be kept uh, for the end of the whole webinar. So after all the speakers are done, we will have a Q&A session where the audience may ask our guests some questions. Um, First, we'll be hearing from Professor Ankur Barua. Uh, Hello, Professor.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
All right. So, hello, everyone. I am very happy to be in your presence, albeit in an online mode. I have a long-standing connection with St. Stephen's College, as long as the 9 or 10 years I spent in Mukherjee West. So let me begin by saying that there are at least 5 distinct perspectives from which we can approach a 15th or 16th century figure such as Kabir. So first, we can read the songs composed by him or attributed to him through a linguistic or philological lens and translate them into a language such as modern standard Hindi, Marathi, English, or Spanish. Second, we can explore the socio-cultural locations that are sketched or reflected in those songs. That is, we can ask questions such as, who are the contemporaries whom Kabir is critiquing? And what are the social systems from within which Kabir is developing these critiques or his compositions? Third, we can situate all these ideas and institutions in the longue durée, that is the long-range history of the Hindu or the Indic tradition stretching from the Vedas, roughly 1500 BCE. So we can ask questions such as, what types of concepts from texts such as the Vedas and the Upanishads, and what types of everyday Hindu and Muslim ritual life are reflected in his songs? Fourth, we can stand back from these kinds of socio-historical inquiries and ask a question about the contemporaneity of Kabir. That is, we can ask, how does Kabir speak to us in our present day circumstances here in Delhi or in Cambridge in 2025? And lastly, fifthly, but not the least, we can explore the visions of Kabir across Hindu and Christian and across Hindu and Muslim borderlines. Now, having said that there are 5 distinct modes of approaching Kabir, I do not mean to suggest that they are mutually opposed. Indeed, for a holistic, proper understanding of Kabir, we would need to develop all of them. On this occasion, since I only have around 20 minutes, I will primarily focus on the third and the fourth perspectives. That is to remind you, I will address these 2 questions. Number 1, how does Kabir recalibrate spiritual visions that are articulated by texts such as the Upanishads? Number 1. And number 2, how does Kabir speak to us today? Now, Here are some slides I will share with you on and off during the talk. So let's begin by showing you these two slides. Okay, I hope you're able to see them. Now, suppose we look at the last 3 millennia of South Asian religious history, social religious history, from a symbolic height of 30,000 feet or 40,000 feet. What would we see from that height? The complex network of ideas, symbolisms, values, and norms that we today put together under the rubric called Hinduism, Hindu-ISM, has been shaped by an ongoing tension, an ongoing conversation, an ongoing dialectic, if you will, between two main sets of scriptures, movements, and institutions. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we see the language of structure, and more specifically, Vedic structure, which is articulated through the language of the Vedas. So the Vedas are these orally transmitted or written scriptures in Sanskrit, and many treatises and commentaries have been written on the Vedas, and these texts, such as the Manusmriti, roughly 200 CE, are often written from patriarchal and androcentric perspectives. Now, one key concept in many of these texts is that term you see there, adhikara. So not all individuals are said to have the socio-ritual entitlement or capacity or eligibility to access Vedic wisdom. On the right-hand side of this slide, we find various attempts to challenge, to interrogate, to undermine, or subvert such Vedic visions of the perfect or the ideal universe. So one such attempt started with someone called Siddhartha Gautama, roughly 400 BCE, and today we cluster the different products of this attempt under the rubric of Buddha-ism or Buddhism. Then there are many Hindu devotional styles called bhakti, of loving God or worshipping God, and they have developed some critiques or interrogations on some aspects of Vedic structure. Again, we have the worship of the goddess or the divine feminine, the Devi, and some of the texts dedicated to the Devi and some of the texts dedicated to bhakti have various kinds of anti-patriarchal and anti-hierarchical idioms. Now, some of these texts are written in the vernaculars across South India and North India. And in these texts, one fundamental concept is the term you see there, Atman. So all individuals are said to be transcendentally or spiritually equal insofar as they are expressions or embodiments of the same spiritual essence. The true center of gravity in the human person is not the biophysical body that is marked with various types of socio-cultural hierarchies, but the Atman that is said to be beyond all such hierarchies. For instance, the Atman does not have a gender, nor does it have a caste marker. In other words, even as certain visions of social hierarchy are being codified by appeal to Vedic authority, we find scriptural verses which interrogate or reject such hierarchical visions. Now, here is such a declaration from the Katha Upanishad, roughly dated at 600 BCE. Whoever sees difference here goes from death to death. In this vein, the second Upanishad you see there says, they who see all beings in their own Atman and see their own Atman in all beings would not feel any hatred or revulsion towards anything. And here is a verse from the Bhagavad Gita. Wise people would see with the vision of equality all these beings, a Brahmin, a cow, an elephant, a dog, and a ritual outcast. In other words, we encounter the claim that difference, whether it is social difference or ritual difference, is somehow unreal or insignificant. Now, if I were a software engineer, I would have drawn some buzzing arrows to show how there is a life tension going on between the right-hand side of this slide, which speaks in the language of adhikara, and the left-hand side of this slide, which speaks in the language of Atman. Sorry, the other way around, the left-hand side in the language of adhikara and the right-hand side in the language of Atman. So the point is not simply that the left-hand side is opposed to the right-hand side and vice versa, but that there is a complex conversation going on between the ideas and the practices on both sides. For instance, even as movements such as bhakti and goddess worship are trying to break away from Vedic normative systems of adhikara, they are sometimes reabsorbed into those very systems. So let's say that all these ideas and practices are found in a state of uneasy coexistence. And here is a contemporary example. Suppose we are all critics in this seminar of what is called transnational finance capitalism. Next, suppose that it is transnational finance capitalism that has facilitated technological advantages or technological advances such as the internet and Zoom meetings. Finally, suppose that we are using the internet precisely to critique transnational finance capitalism. So here is an open-ended question for you. Can we successfully use the language of the system to critique or to subvert the system itself? So likewise, how successfully can one invoke and implement the language of spiritual equality towards undermining a religious system that also promotes the language of social hierarchy? Now, to return to the Hindu visions of ancient India, to repeat what I said a while ago, on the one hand, we have an idealized order of social hierarchy rooted in adhikara, and on the other hand, we have a vision of transcendental sameness. So let's raise a very difficult question. Which voice is more dominant across 3 millennia of Hindu social religious history? Is it the voice of hierarchy or is it the voice of equality? And alternatively, we may ask, do visions of spiritual equality have sufficient real-world momentum to critique or to subvert social institutions which are established through visions of hierarchy? Now, from our symbolic height of 40,000 feet, we find two responses to the highly unstable combination or conjunction between the language of adhikara and the language of Atman. We can characterize the first as gradualism and the second as immediatism. So according to the first answer, if individuals fulfill their adhikara-related duties structured by caste and gender, swadharma, in the present lifetime, they will gradually ascend across multiple reincarnations to the realization of the universal sameness rooted in Atman. So how does this complex set of affirmations and negations work out in the micro negotiations of everyday life? In an address with the title Vedanta and Privilege, here is Swami Vivekananda highlighting the highly unstable conjunction of sociological gradualism and spiritual equality. If I ask one of our priests in India, do you believe in Vedanta? He says, that is my religion. I certainly do. That is my life. Very well. Do you admit the equality of all life, the sameness of everything? Certainly I do. The next moment, when the low-caste man approaches the priest, he jumps to one side of the street to avoid that man. Why do you jump? Because his very touch would have polluted me. But you were just saying we are all the same and you admit there is no difference in souls. He says, oh, that is in theory only for householders. When I go into a forest, then I will look upon everyone as the same. The seemingly inconsistent, even blatantly contradictory combination of assertions comes from a worldview animated by the temporal arrow of karmic causation. The claim is that not everyone is qualified in the here and now to view the world with a vision of sameness. However, if one patiently cultivates one's swadharma as prescribed by one's guru and Vedantic tradition, then one will ascend across multiple lifetimes to the summit of this vision. In many other or some other milieux, however, we find a much more immediatist conceptualization. So here the claim is that individuals must right now immediately concretize their spiritual equality in the here and now, and also override or remove, if necessary, constraints relating to social class and ritual privilege. Here the motive is become what you are. If you are the spiritual self, which is not marked by any social distinctions, become an expression of that transcendental sameness in everyday life in this world. Now, one of the most well-known exponents of what I have here called the second response, that is to say the response of the immediatist type, is Kabir. whose compositions, as you know, robustly reject all markers of caste. Kabir is said to have been born of Muslim parents and raised by Hindu foster parents. Kabir would often write iconoclastic verses against priestly authorities and different aspects of socio-religious hierarchy. In the following verses, he is asking his audiences to turn within and find the true spiritual spark, let's say the spiritual spark of the Atman. Pandit, that is to say Brahmin priest, look into your heart for knowledge. Tell me from where is it that this practice called untouchability emerges, since you believe in it. We eat by touching, we wash by touching. From a touch, the whole world is born. So Kabir asks, Kabir kahe, so who is untouched? And here is another verse. The Pandit got lost in the Vedic details, but missed the mystery of his own self, of his own deep spiritual Atman. Worship, prayers, 6 sacred activities, 4 ages teaching the sacred chant of Gayatri. And yet I ask you, who is truly free? Who's got liberty? You splash yourself if you touch somebody, but tell me who could be lower than you? And proud and vain because of your quality, great with authority. Such pride never brought anyone good. And here is the final exhortation: drop family, drop status, seek the non-existent space, destroy the shoot, destroy the seed, reach the unembodied place. Now, Kabir is usually placed in the category of what are called sants. The word sant may be translated as saint or holy person. The belief systems of the Sant are shaped by a doctrine of grace and the power of the divine name, the emphasis on the purifying power of the pain of separation, viraha, of the human self from the divine lover, and the claim that liberation is accessible to all individuals irrespective of their adhikara. These saints do not worship the they do not worship the different avatars of Hindu deities such as Vishnu. They deny scriptural authority and more vigorously than many Vaishnava groups reject Brahminical ritual privileges and subvert notions of caste hierarchy. Their moral, ethical views, they highlight non-violence, humility, compassion, and reverence for all. Most of these sons belonged to the lower socioeconomic strata, and they were usually illiterate and had no access to Sanskritic education. They used the vernaculars of North India, which were only emerging around their time, and they were instrumental in shaping them into their present literary forms. Thus, Kabir routinely ridicules Brahminical sacrificial rituals, worship puja of divinities, notions of purity and pollution, pilgrimages to holy places, tirtha, and so on. His songs provoke audiences to turn their attention towards the ineffable spirit which is beyond the empirical senses and the utterly transitory world, and can yet be apprehended in the interiority of the human heart by the true seeker. Kabir's songs are symbolic, cryptic, and quite puzzling in many cases. They contain riddles and surprises. Often they end with questions to the audiences. Where may we find expressions today of the ideas of the 15th or 16th century Kabir? To begin with, there are 2 main locations of followers of Kabir or Kabir Panthis today. The first is eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, and the second is Chhattisgarh. Reflecting the tension between the 2 languages of Adhikara and Atman I noted earlier, here are 2 distinct images of Kabir you will encounter in these regions. The sadhus at Kabir Chaura in Benares claim that Kabir was a Brahmin and he was abandoned by a Brahmin widow, while in Chhattisgarh, which is predominantly an Adivasi area, Kabir is said to have appeared miraculously on a lotus in the middle of a lake. For a much more strident rejection of all terminologies and subjectivities of caste, we may turn to the Bauls, who are the wandering minstrels of Bengal. And the Bauls often express the iconoclastic intensity of Kabir. The Bauls draw the attention of their audiences to what is directly perceivable here and now, through the sensory apparatus of the human body. They believe that the divine essence lies hidden in the person of the heart, which is beyond all distinctions of caste, social mores, and cultural conventions. And some Baus in the present-day state of West Bengal have developed folk versions of Advaita Vedanta. According to this Vedantic spiritual vision, all human beings share a fundamental spiritual not-two-ness. And they have directed this non-dualism towards socio-economic issues. So the scholar Jin Openshaw notes, I have often heard even uninitiated rural Bengalis, Muslims as well as Hindus, explain non-dualism as non-differentiation and non-discrimination in a highly radical sense. For example, in terms of lack of possessiveness, the more conventionally religious would rarely draw such radical corollaries of course. In other words, the more quote-unquote conventionally religious may be aware of the quotidian implications of non-dualism in terms of non-egocentricity, but they would not actively pursue these implications to their sociological conclusion. Now, as we move towards the conclusion, let's consider this very big question, which I raised here so that we may return to it in the Q&A. Can ideas and movements which are connected with 15th or 16th century figures such as Kabir bring about long-range social transformation? Or to repeat the question in a more rhetorical vein, why do religions have such a bad track record of concretely implementing the visions of love that they routinely preach? And here is a relatively straightforward answer to a very difficult question. There is a powerful tension between, on the one hand, a religious vision that preaches harmony, unity, and interdependence, and on the other hand, the real world constraints of fragmentation, antagonism, and violence within which that vision has to be implemented. So the world cannot be transformed simply through recitals of theological poetry or devotional music. The world requires structural adjustment with respect to its distribution of material resources. However, even if a group of, say, 50 individuals can become inspired by a cosmological vision to carry out non-egocentric social action, this critical mass can become the site of a much wider systemic transformation. The most enduring divisions constructed in human history are located not in walls of stone, but in barbed wires of the human heart. Yet, if such a heart can somehow become rewired, entire edifices of asymmetry may collapse like a flimsy house of cards. So the crucial point is the if. Sometimes in human history, the gap between theory and practice has been bridged, but perhaps more frequently, the gap has not been bridged. So if theory and practice can form a feedback loop, a bottom-up existential transformation at the grassroots, and top-down systemic reconstruction would become harmonized. Here is an alternative way to make this point. Inequality has both a cognitive or an affective dimension and a structural or material dimension. Knowledge is power. Forms of knowledge are densely embedded in structures of power. So let's say that none of the participants at this seminar right now believe that a particular category of human beings is fundamentally inferior or impure. Even so, we cannot remove at a single stroke the long-range socioeconomic asymmetries which continue to mediate or modulate our individual mentalities and social locations, including those that have made this very seminar possible. In short, between the psychic rewiring of one individual and the systemic transformation of a social formation, there is often a temporal lag, because of which the removal of material inequality remains a formidable challenge. In conclusion, we may say that figures such as Kabir are highlighting the language of immediacy. If we can minimize or even remove the temporal lag between change in one individual and change in a social system, the vision of Atman can become concretely expressed in human history. So let's say everyone at the seminar becomes infused with Kabir's cautionary remarks about the fragility of human existence, the transience of ritual markers of power, the vacuity of social prestige, and so on. In itself, that existential transformation may not amount to much. Indeed, its momentum may dissolve after a few months or a few years. However, let's say that we are somehow able to concretize this momentum through long-range institutional transformation so that this vision of equality is safeguarded and implemented across generations. That is to say, psychic rewiring and structural rewiring will somehow become harmonized. If, and once again we have the difficult if we can do that, Kabir will come alive for us in every generation. So I will end on that note.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your insightful discussion. Uh, Now we will move on to our second speaker, uh, Reverend Samuel John Shekhar. And
Thank you, Anurag. It seems like I have been sandwiched between Cambridge and St. Stephen's College professors. Thank you so much, Anurag and Dr. Barua. It was very insightful. And today I will be talking on the topic, revisiting Kabir's prophetic poetry. Is the screen available? Screen share available?
yes,
Anurag, can you tell me, is the screen share available?
yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. Hello.
Thank you. Every emotion or thought, when it reaches its peak, speaks an outlet for expression. These are conveyed in three ways. First, through meaningful actions. Second, through symbolic gestures. And third, through verbal signs, whether spoken or written. Literature is a record of the human experience. It addresses the fundamental necessity of social relationships. It must be admitted that poetry predates other forms of literature by at least a millennium. This is demonstrated by the Vedas, which embody humanity's poetic expressions of emotions. These earliest written works in the Indian context were composed about 1500 BCE. Vedic poetry is a precise and evocative art form using symbolic language where meaning is densely packed within a verse or couplet. It requires the reader to engage with it at a measured pace, allowing them to grasp the depth of meaning the writer seeks to convey. Just an example from Rig Veda will suffice. This is what Vedic seer wrote: Mount Osurya, this gold-hued chariot, fashioned from many shaped plants of Kimshu and Sharmali wood, strong wheeled, smooth rolling, forth to the world in battle. Prepare for your husband a happy bridal journey. Hanukkah explains the meaning of the various symbols in his Mantra Manjari. He writes the hymn describes the marriage of Surya, daughter of the sun, with Soma, who here personifies the moon. The tradition of writing poems, which started with the Rig Vedas, has continued through the ages till our contemporary times. Holy personalities called saints, like Kabir, Surdas, Namdev, Tukaram, and Ravidas, from 12th to 17th centuries pioneered Indian poetry in new ways, rejecting the sacerdotal and mythological elements. They took up social issues. They aimed at social reform. To understand their writing, one must also keep their context in mind. They were from the subaltern category. For example, Kabir was a weaver and Ravidas was a hide worker. Their writings were not in classical Sanskrit, but in the native vernacular dialects. Their poems aim to bridge the gap between humans and the divine realities. It will be very interesting for us to compare Kabir with other Asian spiritual masters. I would prefer to do with biblical prophets, which we will explore whether Kabir's dohas in their subjects and content is similar to biblical prophetic oracles. But before we delve to address this query, we must understand Kabir's social, poetic, and spiritual tradition. In many cultures and traditions, the experience of divine are expressed in poems which are composed of systematic rhythms and music, making it easy to sing and remember. These poems help the seeker to connect with divine. Thus, sacred poems become mystic, spiritual, and prophetic. The use of poetic language encompasses in itself the ungraspable reality of the divine, which ordinary use of language fails to address. The poetic language can be prose, poem, and dialogue. These have been preserved in the antique scriptures where personal adorations are expressed as anthropomorphism or theopromorphism. I will focus on prophetic genre in the biblical literature and devotional bhakti poems in the Indic literature, drawing out the commonality among the Indic and biblical visions of the divine and the interiority of human heart. The Hebrew prophets and prophecy. The Hebrew for prophet is Nevi'im. The oracles were not mere records of events, but to convey a message in that context. The prophets were concerned with what happened in Israel's history. Their messages were lessons that God's people ought to have learned from Israel's history and their unique relationship with their God, Hashem. Some major prophets whose books are preserved in Hebrew Bible were Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. A prophet represented God and operated as his spokesman in foretelling and forthtelling of events. For example, God told Samuel that he would punish Eli for the sins of his son. The Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of one who hears about it tingle. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sins he knew about his sons blaspheming God, and he failed to restrain them." The above pericope, the Lord foretold his judgment on Eli's family and foretold his judgment on his son's blasphemy. The content of this prophecy was moral. The content of the prophecies highlighted aberration in religious, moral, social, political, and economic spheres in people's and nations' lives. The biblical prophetic themes involve confrontation with political powers, hope for the oppressed, speaking the truth, opting for the poor, telling the future, faithfulness to God, warnings, equality, loving kindness, justice, and suffering. Similar concerns were raised the poems of the sons of the Bhakti tradition, particularly Kabir, which we will study below. Bhakti tradition. The primary meaning of the term Bhakti is rooted in Sanskrit word bhaj, which denotes adoration. It is poetic in form, namely dohas. The basic tenet of this tradition emphasizes loving devotion by concentrating upon God as a singular entity. According to Adolf Otto, the Bhakti tradition is faith in salvation through an external God and through a saving fellowship with Him. Bhakti tradition explores the interplay between the specific and the abstract, the local and the universal, and the actual and the imagined. Love and meditation are the two primary tenets of the Bhakti tradition. The thought pattern, which encompasses the basic principles of Bhaktism, are personal devotion to God, less importance on rites and rituals, monism as monotheism, belief in a single origin of something, participation in a collectivity built on spiritual brotherhood or equality. Bhakti was a pan-Indian phenomenon, yet there are regional variations. Kabir Panthi in northern India, Chaitanyas in Bengal, and Dadupanthi in western India were active in such areas. The sons during the Bhakti movement used to sing to their God in their native languages and travel from place to place, spreading Bhakti synergy through the land. It must be accepted that Sanskrit literature provided the Bhakti poetic genre with some important models, as shlokas or verse from Bhagavad Gita explains it well. Kani sarvani samya yukt asit matpar vashehi yashadriyani tasya pragya pratishta. One who restrains his senses, keeping them under full control and fixes his consciousness upon me, is known as man of steady intelligence. Earlier phases of Bhakti sects were marked by uncertainty and animosity from both Hindu and Muslim rulers due to their heterodox nature. However, they serve as a pivotal purpose in spirituality. Kabir, a poet of the 15th century. In our introduction to the book 100 Poems of Kabir, translated by Rabindranath Tagore, Alvin Underhill writes that these mystics resolve the perpetual opposition between the personal and impersonal, the transcendental and immanent, static and dynamic aspects of the divine nature. In 15th century, the high tide of the mysticism in Indian subcontinent was making its mark. On one hand was Sufism, on the other Bhakti. The former rose out of Islamic tradition, and whereas the later from the Indic culture. It was in the millennium that Kabir was born. About his background, Alvin contends that his name, however, is practically a conclusive proof of a Muslim ancestry, and most probable tale is that which represents him as the actual or adopted child of the Mohammedan weaver of Benares, the city in which the chief events of his life took place. He is said to have been a disciple of celebrated Hindu ascetic Ramananda, who brought religious revival in northern India, which Ramanuja, the great 12th century Brahmin reformer, had initiated in the south. In his research from various sources, Purushottam Agrawal, a JNU, that is Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi scholar, argued that Kabir was born a Julaha, a weaver in northern India. He was a Muslim who became an ardent devotee of the path of Nirguna Brahman, a deity without attributes. He practiced and propagated bhakti, a complete devotion to the Nirguna deity. As a saint of bhakti tradition, Kabir spoke to his listeners and chanted his verses that divine is not only Nirguna, that is free of attributes, but also Nirankar, without form, and Niranjan, that is pure and flawless. Is there a prophetic vision in Kabir's poetry? That is what we are going to look today. Prophetic tradition is unique to Jewish spirituality. In Kabir's tradition, the emphasis is on loving devotion to a personal deity and the yearning of the bhakta, a devotee, towards the deity. Kabir poem serves as a timeless critique of the social structure of his time and beyond. Granted that bhakti developed a tradition of loving devotion to deity, but to identify a prophetic element in it remains contested. However, it is possible to trace values that are common to Kabir and the prophets. The poetic vision was not about foretelling the future in a conventional sense, but about disclosing uncomfortable truths to those who exploit and oppress the poor and the weak. Let us explore common elements in Kabir and the prophets. First is love. There is a common theme of love both in biblical prophetic writing and Kabir's poem. Let us take a well-known doha below. Pothi padi padi jak muha, pandit bhayanak koi, hai akshar prem padhe so pandit koi. One does not become a pandit, that is a learned person, merely by reading books. Instead, understanding love, equality, and justice can elevate one to the status of a great scholar. The theme of love is common. Prophet Hosea writes that God reveals to him about divine love for Israel. I will heal their waywardness and love them freely, for my anger has turned away from them. However, there is an inserting difference. Kabir speaks as a human to his fellow human beings, whereas Hosea speaks as God's spokesman to people. The first represents a human word, the later is God's word. Second is warning. Kabir warns the people against their treatment of the weak, as the cries of the oppressed or the helpless are powerful and can bring judgment upon their tormentor. दुर्बल को ना सताइए जाकी मोती हाय बिना जीव की हाय से लोहा भस्म हो जाए. Do not torment the feeble who heave harrowing sighs. The soul's bellows also sigh, and iron liquefies. The biblical prophetic warnings, God warns Israel of the punishment for their sins. For instance, the prophet Amos writes, "This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Israel, even for 4, I will not relent. They sell the innocent for silver and needy for a pair of sandals." Kabir and Amos share their similar prophetic values, despite the difference in perspectives, namely that the Doha is from human sense and the oracle is from God, equality and justice. Kabir tells his disciples not to accumulate wealth, but ask the divine to give them enough for their family and for the pious ones who come to them, so they may also do justice with them. साईं इतना दीजिए जा मैं कुटुंब समाए मैं भी भूखा ना रहूं साधु भूखा जाए. Lord, give me just enough that my family has bread, that neither I'll starve nor the pious go. That way neither I'll starve nor the pious go unfed. This is what the Lord Almighty said. Administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Do not plot evil against each other. Kabir visions climbs with the prophecy of Zechariah, which is about the human existence, compassion, and ultimate unity of all beings. The Doha does talk about the common theme of justice and love and to treat others fairly and kindly. Kabir Dohas often highlight the universality of human experience and his vision in shaping a syncretic culture. His thoughts underscore the significance of the importance of fellow humans as a creed that transcends all others. The message conveyed in Kabir's couplets is universal, transcending the boundaries of religion and caste and rejecting religious dogmas. They speak of wisdom and straightforward living, the gospel. कबीर खड़ा बाजार में लिए लुकाठी हार जो घर फूके अपनों चले हमारे साथ. Kabir's phrases are refreshing, straightforward, and carry a rustic charm, that is the khari bol. He positions himself in a common area, inviting every where people gather for their daily needs. He holds as a staff and urges those who want to join him to prepare themselves for the journey by setting their house on fire. Leave no path for retreat. Jesus of the Gospel says to the young man who comes to him and wants to be his disciple, Jesus replied, "No one puts a hand on the plow and looks back is fit for the service of the kingdom of God." Both Gospel and Kabir suggest the level of commitment and dedication required to follow him with undivided loyalty. These words resonate deeply with the iconoclastic idiom and prophetic visions, stirring the emotions of those seeking the divine. चाहे गीता बाछिए या पढ़िए कुरान, तेरा मेरा प्यार ही और पुस्तक का ज्ञान. Kabir addresses his followers, emphasizing that whether they read the Quran or Gita, wisdom within these texts advocates for the harmonious love among people. As a disciple of Ramananda and an ascetic, he recognized that love for one another and humility foster tolerance and self-control. This reflects Kabir's prophetic vision, suggesting the possibility of a space free from hatred and intolerance. Kahi Kabir Kari ke le ub vyuhar, Ram naam jane bina ho budi hua sansar. The saint wants to speak of his time and beyond, urgently calling out to all humanity that this world is filled with entanglements. These entanglements may arise from worldly desires, that is Maya, or yearning for liberation, that is moksha. Even the struggle of shifting through various scriptures and texts, Gyan can lead to confusion. Kabir emphasizes that without a true encounter with the divine, whom he refers to as Ram, the soul will continue to perish in a world of misconception. His message, articulates nearly 700 years ago, remains profoundly relevant today. बड़ा हुआ तो क्या हुआ, जैसे पेड़ खजूर, पंथी को छाया नहीं, फल ला गया धूप. Kabir tells his disciples and listeners that even if one holds a high status or stature in society, it can be meaningless if they resemble a date tree, large and impressive, but of little help to others. A date tree provides no shade for travelers, and its fruit is difficult to reach. Kabir conveys that a person may be blessed by the divine, but without humility and gratitude in their relationship with others, they become like these towering dates, outwardly grand, yet lacking in true value. His couplets remain relevant today as they emphasize the importance of being pragmatic and meaningful in everyday life. Let me conclude. The essay delves in Kabir's prophetic vision, which align with the prophetic insights found in Hebrew and Christian traditions. He delivers messages of religious harmony, social reform, spiritual wisdom, and the eternal quest for divine. Kabir transcends the role of a mere prophet or sant. He preached and sang songs that expressed his belief in Nirgun Brahman. His teachings resonate with a prophetic voice akin to that of prophets in Hebrew Bible, and the gospel of the New Testament, boldly denouncing the evils of social order. Kabir started his movement of bhakti way back in medieval age when social life was different from modern civilization, challenging the rigid structures of caste and religion through his poem. In Shabd 41, which Professor Barua has also mentioned, Kabir speaks to the point. Look in your heart for knowledge. Tell me where untouchability came from, since you believe in it. Mix red juice, white juice, and air. A body bakes in a body. As soon as the eight lotuses are ready, they come into the world. Then what's untouchable? 84,000 vessels decay into dust, while the potter keeps slapping clay on the wheel, and with a touch cuts each one of them. We eat by touching, we wash by touching, and from touch the world was born. So who's untouched? Asked Kabir. Only she who's free from delusions. This contrasts with the divisions of caste based on innate qualities. Since Kabir's life experience as a Julaha, weaving fabric for the family's livelihood, shows that one can bring about a change in the current social conditions via one's labor. Kabir, in his prophetic vision, points out the reality of those around him and beyond his age. He points out that world grapples with spiritual emptiness, social divisions, and material excess. Amid such apprehensions, Kabir's sayings are timeless facets, talking about changes that can be brought in about society and religion, society and human nature. His poems serve as a guide to his listener and readers towards a more compassionate and awakened way of life. Despite their antiquity, they sound fresh and relevant in our times. Finally, from the above discussion, it can be concluded that Kabir meets songs, meditation, love, and peace as common themes, keeping his message simple and accessible. He envisions a synthesis reminiscent of Isaiah's prophecies in Hebrew Bible, where the wolf and lamb dwell together, fostering empathy and love among people. Yet, the unfortunate reality is that the qualities of the qualities that unite humanity remains elusive, just as they were in Kabir's time. In a world still grappling with sectarianism, materialism, and spiritual emptiness, Kabir's vision holds as much significance today as it did in era. His words challenge individuals to rise above external identities and seek the divine within themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend, for that insightful comparative study in Kabir and the prophets of the Old Testament. Hello. Oh,
Hello. Can the audience please tell me if I'm audible? All right. So now we will move on to our third speaker, Dr. Alphy Geever. Ma'am,
Hello. Hi, Anurag.
yes.
Am
Hello,
I
ma'am.
audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
Please go
excellent.
ahead.
Thanks, Anurag. And before I start, I want to say how extremely happy I am to be presenting alongside Dr. Barua, because when I joined college, Dr. Barua was among one of the first teachers, and he took Indian philosophy for us. So this is a very special day. And I'm extremely grateful to the chaplaincy for making this reflection on Kabir possible. I also want to thank Dr. Barua and Reverend Samuel for the area that they have covered. because that allows me to take up the space that I have to engage with the idea of how Kabir traditions are, how there are so many of Kabir traditions, and there is a plurality to what we typically refer to as the traditions associated with Kabir, that sometimes gets invisibilized when we look at Kabir within one particular lens. So authenticating Kabir's life and verses has been complex for historians because of the nature of evidence available to us about Kabir. Kabir is traditionally located in what is called the Bhakti Kal, that is between 15th and 17th centuries. Although the date of his birth is somewhat debated, we know with some certainty that he died in 1518. It is believed that he was born in Banaras. Towards the end of his life, he was driven out of Banaras to Maghara, according to one narrative, near Gorakhpur, where he is believed to have died. The Kabir, who was persecuted by both Muslims and Hindus during his lifetime, upon his death was fought over by these two groups on the matter of what final rights were to be given to him. As the legend goes, as the fight was happening, Kabir appeared to them and instructed them to lift the shroud where his body was supposed to be kept. To the surprise of all the people present there, instead of his body, they found a heap of flowers. The two groups then decided to divide this flower amongst them, with the Hindus taking their share of the flowers and cremating it and throwing the ashes in the Ganga at Banaras, and the Muslims burying it and building a shrine at the site of burial. So as Dr. Barua and Reverend Shekhar have also shown, Kabir belongs to everyone. This is illustrated by the verse, Hari ne aisi rela banai, bet chalo mere bhai. There is an asynchronism because obviously railways didn't exist at the time when Kabir was alive. But this asynchronism shows the diverse ways in which Kabir is owned, sometimes defying even the commonsensical logic of space and time. The fact that Kabir lived in Banaras could have been the reason for his vast authority in Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Punjab, Chhattisgarh, and even as far as Puri in Orissa. As a hub of students, tradesmen, performers, and religious travelers, Kabir's words would have appeared to be fertile ground for radical thought for people from all walks of life. Kabir's works have come down to us in three literary forms: dohas, couplets, or sakhi, witnesses, ramayanis, pad, or shabd. And each of these forms are demonstrated in the different records of Kabir's teachings. To begin an engagement with Kabir, it is vital to look at the social and cultural fabric of where Kabir is located. Within the broader framework of what we now call the Hindu way of life, social and religious life is organized along the lines of dharma. Dharma, and continues to be so today, is embodied in people's lives. They teach character, discernment, and determine the course of life of individuals with respect to their roles within the fabric of social and religious practices. Dharma is taught through portrayals of personal commitment, resourcefulness, and endurance in the face of societal pressures. They were a part of life even before they were codified at various points in history for administrative purposes. Bhakti is not dharma. Its literature expects a certain individuality, even idiosyncrasies of its practitioners that defy the diktats of dharma. Thus, bhakti sensibilities are more directly related to questions about the historical authorship of texts. The perceived personality of Kabir becomes a real matter of care for the reception of his poetry. Whether he was really a weaver, a Julaha belonging to a lower caste, a Muslim family, walking across the streets of Banaras, defying all odds to get tutelage under a Hindu teacher, equally hated by both Muslims and Hindus. Except for, maybe as the legend goes, Sikandar Lodi, who seems to have appreciated his idiosyncrasies and spared his life when he was accused of blasphemy. Bhakti, translated as love of God in a very vague and a very broad sense, posed the most serious challenge to the canons of Dharma, because it did precisely the opposite of what Dharma was designed to do. Bhakti poets defined wisdom to lie in the transgression of the canons. It implored individuals to disturb social norms and be disturbed by teachings of figures like Kabir, Meera, Ravi Das, and Surdas. Bhakti proposed an ethic based on individual responsibility for cultivating a character of love and adoration beyond the performed aspects of religious life. The life of Bhakti had threatening consequences for the idea of an ordinary life. It demanded more from those who came under its spell. Whereas Dharma established communities based on social differentiation and complementary social functions, Bhakti reversed this by reuniting socially disparate elements in a common cause, the praise of Ram. So Ram here is not the Ram of Ramayana, but a general word for the representing the idea of a transcendent God. Bhakti was committed to liberating particularly the marginalized from the social contexts which subordinated them. To do this, Bhakti poems typically reversed power structures and roles facilitated by Dharma. Brahmins became receivers of generosity, in at least the minimal sense of receiving teachings from sants. Women became abhaya or fearless, like Mirabai, who breaks free from conventions of a married life to roam on the streets, singing hymns in praise of Krishna. And kings and queens are implored to serve the community, as opposed to those at the very bottom of the oppressive Chaturvarna system. Kabir himself refused to observe Dharma, saying, Bhakti bimukh jo dharma, so adharma. Dharma was no dharma if it stood opposed to bhakti. Hawley mentions that Ravidas neglected his duties as a son by abandoning his parents. Tulsidas shares a meal with a murderer, and Kabir himself apparently travels in the company of a sex worker to keep the crowds away. I now turn to a discussion of the pluralistic ways in which Kabir traditions have developed and evolved across the northern parts of the Indian subcontinent. We start at the difficulties emerging from categorizing Kabir within Nirguna or Saguna traditions. Historians of Hindi literature commonly make a distinction between Nirgun and Sagun Bhakti. The sons of Nirgun Bhakti, such as Kabir and Ravidas, envision the supreme principle to be beyond the realm of predicable reality. As people who've done logic with me are aware, any predicate that is used to describe the one creates in cognition a discursive duality between substance and attitude. And this is precisely what Nirgun Bhakti avoids. The bhaktas of Sagun Bhakti, namely Surdas, Tulsidas, and Mirabai, use vivid and aesthetic attributes to bring the concept of God closer to the imagination. Krishna, for instance, is described as Pitambar, he who is clothed in yellow, the physician who is dark, etc. Scholars like Karine Shoma have argued that it is difficult to locate Kabir within such a neat dichotomy of Sagun or Nirgun Bhakti, because there is a range of personalities associated with the legendary Kabir. The coarse Kabir of the Bijak is different from the warm and hearty domestic Kabir of the Adi Granth. And both of them are altogether different from the mystical Kabir of the Panchavani. The Western Kabir, that is the Kabir traditions which are prevalent and spread across Rajasthan and Punjab, is intimate, devotional, and bhakti oriented, as compared to the Eastern Kabir, which is the traditions that developed nearer to Banaras. The Sikh Kabir appears to be a householder. Kabir himself is believed to have been a family man, married to Loi, with a son named Kamal, a daughter, and a daughter-in-law. So a fully family-oriented, socially rooted man. The Vaishnava Kabir is guided by the intensity of love. The Kabir of the Bijak, which is the main central text followed by the Kabir Panth, on the other hand, is the confrontational, interrogating, and revolutionary Kabir, the Eastern Kabir, who through his coarse rhetoric derides, berates, and challenges different forms of social authority. He openly declares that he has no use for a pen and a paper to declare wisdom. He asserts that Hindu, Muslim, Qazi, Brahman are all cut from the same cloth. The Eastern manuscripts are much younger than their Western counterparts. They are traced back to as early as the 1800s. And it is ironical because the Eastern manuscripts, which are more closely associated to to Banaras, where Kabir is from, it appears that, like the proverbial prophet, he was unwelcome in his own village while being popular elsewhere, because the evidences for Eastern manuscripts come much later compared to the evidences for Western manuscripts. This could possibly be because of the positioning of members of the Kabir Panth, who wouldn't have had the resources for textual preservation and propagation. Its members are unlikely to have been literate, much like Kabir himself, who is believed to have been unlettered. Kabir's teachings, addressed to the oppressed communities, declared that liberation was for everyone. His devotion was premised on the conviction of the divine as one single presence in all living beings. Anchoring Kabir within the context of his influences is a deeply complex task for scholars. The story of how Kabir becomes a student of Ramananda locates him within the Vaishnavite tradition, which was itself undergoing change in the light of Ramanuja's Dvaita teaching of Vedanta, the duality of the Atman and Brahman. But this account has been reported by members of other marginalized communities to be yet another tool for appropriation. The orally transmitted Kabir histories of the time give little evidence to confirm the Ramananda story according to Hawley, although other scholars have taken this to be a definitive movement. Hawley sides with the marginalized critics and argues that the parampara between Ramananda and Kabir, and by extension between Ramanuja, locating Kabir within the Vaishnavite tradition, is an invention to deny Kabir his Muslim roots and upbringing. The narrative of Kabir exposing his wife for an attack by a grocer, for instance, for his spiritual commitment to feeding sadhus, and the very story about him tricking Ramananda into taking him as a disciple. Stories such as these point to the general temperaments of the lack of propriety in the members of marginalized groups to follow respectable patterns of behavior, as set by the dominant castes. It thus becomes important to access the Kabir traditions through a political lens and also look at the traditions that reclaim Kabir from being lost to dominant traditions. The creation of an image of Kabir as an ideal Indian mystic poet led to the flattening of the traditions of his multiple plural identities. It eclipsed the claims of the marginalized communities of India. These transformations were facilitated, to take just one instance, by the Hindi print editions published 1907 onwards, the Bengali anthologies of Chiti Mohan Sen, the English translations by Ajit Kumar Chakravarti, the book 100 Poems of Kabir by Tagore and Evelyn Underhill, as well as more contemporary collections like Kabir, the Weaver's Songs by Vinay Dharwadekar, are instances of this transformation. Vinay Dharwadekar is an interesting figure because he also is a Stephanian who followed the same trajectory as Professor Barua. He did physics in college and then went on to do philosophy. He was also a student of A.K. Ramanujan. So when somebody like Vinay Dharwadekar writes a book, it becomes the text that the West accesses traditions like the Kabir traditions by. Scholars like Purushottam Agarwal have cautioned against the limitations of idealizing Kabir into a particular homogeneous identity, but they encourage us instead to study the many Kabirs through the multiplicity of his images transmitted amongst diverse communities. One way to do this is to move away from the idea of establishing an authentic Ur text for Kabir, as this devalues the validity of different manuscripts and oral traditions. Linda Hess has pointed to the importance of diverting more attention to the oral traditions of Kabir verses, employing philological and comparativist methods, which will better equip scholars to map the dynamic trajectories of Kabir traditions. Hawley also cautions against the grand narrative of the Bhakti movements or the Bhakti Kal, for it is also a construct of the nationalist period in India, in which multiple retrospective projections were made onto the past. The past was carefully curated by the indigenous intelligentsia to respond to the damning narratives of religious heresy and incapacity for civilized and rational realization of divinity, often proposed by the colonial administration, but also by missionaries in some contexts. However, not all accounts of the Kabir traditions are similarly damning of the spiritual lives of the colonized. To take a closer look, I'll briefly examine Kabir within Christian imaginations. Two sources that I looked at are Bishop George Westcott, the Bishop of Lucknow from 1910 to 1928, who was a missionary working for the SPG, Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and the more familiar Evelyn Underhill, an English Anglo-Catholic writer, particularly invested in practical Christian mysticism. Westcott argues in the introduction to Kabir and Kabir Panth that it is highly probable that Bhakti movements interacted with and were influenced by Christian theories. The presence of Christians in southern parts of the subcontinent and also the possible interaction with Catholic traditions of the Portuguese in Goa, for example, could have shaped some of the mystical elements of Kabir traditions. Underhill does not allude to any such influences, but instead she points to how Kabir could be seen and related to Christian mystical traditions. As Evelyn's views have much to do with Western mystical views, they represent one of the key ways in which the West sees Kabir, a syncretic view of mysticism that does not belong to any one tradition. She agrees with Kabir's criticism of austerities that are characteristic of Oriental mystical traditions. As Kabir says, the yogis discipline their bodies and dye their clothes, but do not dye their minds. The idea of liberation, particularly as a passive annihilation of the self, is rejected by Underhill. But in Kabir, she sees an enthusiastic champion of active mysticism, practical mysticism, as the title of her book goes, that is focused on bringing back the message of liberation to the ordinary people of the world. Mysticism in Kabir is articulated through four modalities, which Underhill finds to be significant: spiritual pilgrimage, marriage, transmutation, and divine immanence in nature. Of these, I will be focusing on the aspect of divine immanence, as it is one of the more prevalent themes in Kabir's verses. Kabir's mysticism demonstrates an otherworldly passion for the infinite, but one which is accessible to all. He dabbles in lofty abstractions about the divine, but his feet are firmly planted on earth. According to this tradition of Kabir, or this reading of Kabir, God reveals himself in nature. The opposition between the spiritual and the corporeal is transcended in devotion. Kabir never adopted the life of the professional ascetic who retires from the world in order to undergo bodily mortification. Kabir's interior life, which reminds one of the interior castles, for example, of Century Surf Avila, of adoration, and his artistic expression positioned him as a sane mystic for Underhill. His location within the realities of the world is most evidently demonstrated in his commitment to his craft as a weaver, which anchors his presence in the world. It facilitates the meditations of his heart, strengthening his imagination of the world as threads of contrasting colors being woven into tapestries of Maya. The homely life provides the opportunities for experiencing love, especially love that takes one to a state of union where distinctions of I and thou vanish. Underhill positions Kabir among St. Augustine and Rumi, who achieved a similar synthetic vision of God. God that surpasses the dichotomy of the mortal and the divine and is unified in the synthesis of what is more than God, one actuality. The grammar of this devotion, according to Underhill, is love. Thus, we see that the visions of the divine, as we look for them in the teachings of Kabir, open up a rich and diverse matrix of ideas with multiple claims to the Kabir tradition, each of them valid. If one is forced to identify universal concepts or themes within this tapestry, it leads to the privileging of some accounts over the others, which is also like participating in the appropriation of discourses of the marginalized by the dominant castes. Nevertheless, Kabir traditions hold great value across emancipatory discourses. That's the most universal thing that you can say about Kabir, especially one that propound divinity within a naturalistic ontology. As Kabir continues to be read and reread through the 21st century, new claims and reclamations shall guide us in delving deeper into the many-colored garment that are the Kabir traditions. Thank you.
So much, ma'am, for your enlightening discussion. We will now open the floor to questions. And if the audience members have questions, they may raise their hands so that I can unmute them. We won't spend a lot of time on questions, maybe about 10 to 15 minutes. If you do have any, please raise your hands. All right, then. I don't think the audience members have any questions. Now I will allow our speakers to make any closing remarks if they have any at all. Uh, and then we might end the session.
I don't have any closing remarks, but if I may, I have a question for Alfie. I mean, is that allowed? Can your speaker ask a question?
Yes, yes, sir.
You used a very interesting phrase. You say the naturalistic ontology of Kabir. Why did you use that phrase?
Because while a lot of his dohas are pointing to a transcendent idea of God, there are also evidences to locate him within that tradition of finding divinity in nature, that idea of immanence.
Okay.
And so there is an argument that his concept of the divine is an immanent God and not the transcendent God, which is separated from the corporeal world. So that's the sense in which I use that phrase.
All right, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, beyond that, I mean, I don't have anything in particular to say.
Sir?
How about you, Anurag? Do you not have some critical
I was just waiting for that.
because I mean, I can take these liberties because Anurag happens to be in my class. So I did this to him in class. I'm going to do it to him now.
Ma'am, I'll get back to you on.
Okay.
Right. So, now that we've reached the end of this discussion, I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Professor Barua, Reverend Samuel, and Alphy ma'am, for their enlightening and insightful discussion on this topic. I would also like to thank our principal, Professor John Verghese, for giving us the opportunity to organize this discussion, as well as all of the audience members for joining in and making the discussion vibrant. Uh, Thank you so much, everyone. The video recording for the discussion will be made available on the Chaplaincy's YouTube channel as well as the Facebook page. And so, if you missed out any part of the discussion, you can look it up there. Thank you, everyone. And yes.
Thank you, Anurag.
Thank you, Reverend Samuel. Thank you, Dr. Barua.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Barua. It was wonderful listening to you. Thank you.